Hello everyone, welcome to the Statera podcast. Today I'm joined by my good friend Les, who's over from Sydney and he's here for a few days. So he's off tomorrow, so we thought, great opportunity to get him in today and have a talk on the Statera podcast and about a few different things. So we caught up on Saturday night and had a good conversation about had a good conversation about dreaming and lucid dreaming and the meaning behind them and any lessons, etc. that come from them. So what do you think, Les? We'll have a chat about it and get your experiences, I guess, on it especially, and
sounds good,
and how you're going with it. So
so as we were saying, we were having a few conversations on Saturday night, and one of the things I said to you quite initially was that I've come to the opinion or the belief that a lot of my dreams are not dreams necessarily, but perhaps memories from incarnations outside of this one, based on my own personal sort of philosophical existential beliefs. But as I was saying to you before, or a little bit earlier on, so I have a vast spread of dreams, and I a lot of them are quite vivid. A lot of them would perhaps qualify as lucid, maybe some of them just qualify as just being vivid. A lot of the time there is a great deal of sensory input. Sometimes some senses are limited, some aren't. A lot of the time I control my actions, and a lot of them are very strangely often either martial or political in nature, or perhaps a little bit of both. They're always from my own perspective for the majority of them, and sometimes there's a sense of there being a string of events that are all connected over a long period of time. Sometimes they're short in that they're just a singular event happening in a space of 5 minutes or a couple of hours or something to that effect. But one of the main reasons that I've come around to the notion of them perhaps being memories as opposed to messages or culminations of input of from your conscious waking day is the sense that often, even if they are quite vivid and I've got a lot of sensory input and a lot of control over my actions, in spite of the fact that I have control over my actions and the things that I'm saying, the events are very much scripted, or not scripted rather, but I'm actually reliving or living a chain of events rather than actually being able to have any actual control over changing the circumstances of the things that are happening around me.
So it's not like an abstract dream where then something weird happens and pops up and you're like, wow, it's just follows some sort of structure.
They often tend to follow some sort of structure. Often there are elements where there will be a shift in focus and suddenly I'll be in another room or in another part. That's why I say sometimes it feels like I'm getting snapshots of a series of events. And often, because you're in the perspective of experiencing this series of events or this thing that's happening in a room, but suddenly when you shifted and you're suddenly somewhere else, there's that disorientation, like you're still wanting to finish off what you were saying in that room, but then you're somewhere else and you're adapting to that. But then you adapt quickly and you realize that your actions and the things you're saying are actually going along with what's happening in the new scenario, but my consciousness, my lag is catching up with the fact that I've just been moved from one scene to another. So that's sort of like that covers the spread of a lot of them. Then I have other sorts of dreams that are just a little bit more along the traditional line of it'll just be something really weird, like it'll be me in a room in a much more modern sort of setting, and there'll be someone just having a conversation, or sometimes there will just be abstract dreams that are just the kind of dreams that you would expect to have, that are just sort of a bit all over the place, and those are the kind of dreams that are obviously the input of the day's events, or your mind just stitching things together. But above and beyond all of those, I wanted to in particular speak about two particular events. Now these two dreams in particular, I'm just trying to think about which order to do with them. One of them is probably my best example of a lucid dream, but it's also an example of something I think that was happening outside of the conventional realms of what I would normally define to be a dream as well. And the other is one of the more classic examples of the sorts of dreams I was just referring to, but it was a dream in which I was killed, but that wasn't the end of my dream. So in the dream I traversed from being incarnated, killed, and I went back to I suppose the way I would describe it is I went back to the source. I went back to the other side.
And did you start off, you said you were incarnated, was it as you were incarnated, or was there a moment before you were incarnated as well?
I was living day-to-day events of a life, and it was a very particular, so I'll start with that one. So as I mentioned, a lot of my dreams are strangely martial in nature or involved in various political scenarios. A lot of them take places either in in a timeline of events on this world that couldn't be the current timeline of events, or on perhaps other worlds, or in just settings that seem so foreign to the way that the recent sort of couple thousand years have come to pass that they don't seem like they would be part of the current chain of continuity. I'm always dreaming from my perspective, and I know that it's me, but more often than not, it's not me, obviously, as it would have been in this life. So that's what's led me to believe that there are memories from other incarnations. In this particular dream, I was part of a 4-man special forces team. We were on a continent. I'm not sure if it was this world or another world. I don't believe it to be this world. It was another world. It was an arid continent. Our objective was to insert a short space from a well-fortified enemy fortress, I suppose is probably the way to describe the thing. Infiltrate this fortress because there were high-value targets in the enemy is the only way they're referred to in my head, operating out of this particular fortress, and they were about to have a very important strategic meeting. So our objective was to, I think, essentially eavesdrop on this meeting and get intelligence and get out. It was incredibly, it was a suicidal mission. We weren't expected to all survive, but the notion was that we would garner something of great use to a much grander conflict that was happening.
Sure, there was importance to it, and you could feel that importance.
Very much so.
Right.
And I can remember the approach through a winding valley that sort of came in and out of a river that was flowing nearby to this particular fortification. But I'm going to skip through the actual approach and all the other bits and pieces. I can go back to verify to say that it was late afternoon when we were on our approach as well, which is strange that we were approaching during the daytime. The culmination of this particular mission is that we were captured. So it was a 4-man team. 2 of the men were killed in firefight in the process of being discovered. And my lieutenant and I were captured and brought not to a dungeon or an interrogation room, but strangely to actually the very command center, or the very room where the meeting we were supposed to be eavesdropping was being held. We were very specifically brought there for a specific reason. Now, the lieutenant in this dream, I knew to be my friend Kurt Wensley, who I've known since I was about 10 years old in this life. It wasn't his face, but I knew it was him.
Yeah, right.
It was his soul.
Sure.
So we're brought to this room, and it's like a command center, a war room. There's a holographic projection in the middle of the room, which is displaying in vivid red in 3 dimensions a fleet in orbit above this planet. And
this planet that you were on.
This particular planet that I'm on. And there is the overall chief commander of their forces in this particular area is in this room, and he's got a couple of his staff commanders beneath him in this room having a meeting. And in particular, one of these staff commanders is having a distinct argument with the overall commanding officer, who is the person that we were meant to be getting intel from, about some particular aspect of the way they were carrying this war out, and the way that would filter out back to the greater conflict elsewhere in the world. Now, so we were on our knees at this point, bound. Kurt was just off to the left of me. I was here. They were just on the other side of this projection is sort of happening just over here. They're on the other side of this thing having an argument. Now, this overall commanding officer in this room, he was one of the most malevolent entities I could possibly conceive of. The term closest in the English current language would be the devil, and that wouldn't even begin to cover the pure, just absolute hatred and evil and just absolute distortion to space-time that this thing was. And I would say thing, because I would say that he too was incarnated and very much wearing a veil over what he really was. I could feel pure terror just being in the same room as this thing. And I was just blown away by the nerve of the staff officer arguing with this commanding officer, and almost came to a point where I think in this particular life I was aware that I was incarnated. So this is what's sort of coming back around through a lot of what happens from this point forward. And I was looking at this staff officer thinking, you clearly don't realize that as soon as this argument is finished, you are dead. He is not going to let you live through this. But it wasn't just that alone. It was just that this particular staff officer didn't seem to have any idea who or what he was dealing with necessarily, much less what his place was. And anyway, the argument did finish up, and he was executed summarily right there on the spot. And I just shook my head because, of course, they're enemy combatants to me. It makes no difference to me.
Yeah.
This entity, as soon as he'd executed the staff officer that he was his own man, he was having an argument with, casually strolled up to where Kurt was kneeling just to the left of me, drew his sidearm, shot Kurt in the head. And I felt Kurt's soul leave his body. He's gone. Okay, he's headed back to the source. And this entity came up to me, and he brought us to that room, and he knelt us down, I knew, for a very particular reason, because he knew who I was, and he knew why I'd been chosen to lead that particular team and why I'd been chosen to lead that mission. And I think we'd had a run-in or two before, and he basically came to deliver a pitch, and a recruitment pitch more than anything else. He came to me and he said not more than a couple of sentences, a couple of paragraphs. He spoke to me about how the underpinning logic or lack thereof at the basis or the underside of this war and why it's being carried out was completely redundant. The perspective on good or evil or any of the rest of those things were completely irrelevant, and that I knew what the fundamental mechanics underpinning this whole thing were. And so for that exact reason, I should know why he was doing what he was doing, and that there was not technically any way, if you abstract out to the most fundamental way of looking at the universe, to villainize him for what he was doing.
Sure.
And he knows that I knew that he was right to some degree, and that serving what the cause that I was serving as in opposition to him was just as invalid for the same reason. But in spite of the fact that that's true, it didn't change that as an entity, this thing, I refuse to refer to even him as I almost refuse to personify him, but that's me being petty to some degree. He, just by the very dint and notion of what he is, what he stands for, what he exists to be, I just refused to cooperate. And basically, in his few words, told him to get fucked. Basically, like, you know, in very plain working man's language, fuck off. Like, ain't no way this is going to happen. And he said something very specific at the end. I can't remember verbatim this conversation. This dream occurred in about, it was either 2010 or 2011.
Okay.
It was while I was living here in Perth. And he said something very pointed at the end, one sentence or two sentences that were meant to just be a direct jab that I would remember after this. And then he said, well, obviously you're of no further use to me, and steps around to the side. So I'm knelt on the ground, arms behind me, and he had to step to the side. He made a point of not stepping deliberately behind me to stab me from behind, but he didn't use his sidearm either. He made a point of using a blade as opposed to a sidearm. He stepped to my side, he crouched down beside me, and he put the knife up under the back of my rib cage, in here, up through one lung, or sort of across, piercing one lung and into my heart.
Yeah, right.
And I felt it was so. He managed to find a gap in my armor because I was still wearing the combat suit that I was wearing.
Sure.
So he managed to find a gap in the armor, put the blade through, up, and I felt it go in and up, and hit my heart. And there was like a supposed sensation like a clap, and I felt. Imagine being strapped to a rocket,
right? Okay.
And fired. Like a rocket wouldn't even be able to get this fast.
Sure.
Imagine being strapped to some mode of transportation that can move exceptionally quickly and fire directly upwards. And so I felt my soul leave my body, and at that point, perception in terms of visual input sort of dissolved, and I was getting more the impression of the feeling of being moving upwards, and just vague sensation like fields of colours in front of my perception. But I remember feeling like I was going upward, not at a consistent rate, actually at a rate of acceleration. So I was slowly getting faster and faster and faster. So there was a sensation of building acceleration, and then I hit something. But again, like sensory input at this point wasn't quite what it conventionally would be. It felt like hitting the ceiling, but of course it didn't hurt. And then I melted through the ceiling, as it were, and then, still in the dream, not actually waking up to a conscious level yet, I woke up and gasped. And I was laid out the way that, you ever seen the way they bury European knights? Like sort of at length, like this.
Oh, okay, right.
Over their chest.
Yeah,
I was laid out on what would be a dais, say perhaps about as wide as this table, maybe about 3 or 4 times its length, long enough for me to be so at the height I am now, perhaps, sort of laid out head to toe with space either side. And this room it's all very, very simple, very clean geometry. So it was literally wall, roof. There were 2 portals out of this room. And again, I say portals, but they were just clear cut spaces in the wall. and there were this dais, and actually the construction of the whole room in general was all made out of a substance that looked like it could have been concrete, it could have been glass, it could have been metal, or it could have been some substance that was like an amalgamation of those things.
It looked foreign to anything that you've seen
but also so much more simple than anything I've ever seen, and also very familiar in a strange way, very familiar and very foreign all at the same time. And it had an off-white colour to it, this particular dais that I was on, and there were 8 other daises laid out to the left of me, and I was on the one furthest to the right of this room. Looked to the left, expect to see Kurt on the one to the left of me, but realised there'd been a bit of time delay between his being killed and mine, so I knew that he'd gotten up and left this room already. As soon as I came to, as I said, there was one portal to the left and another one to the right. The one to the right was darkened, because, as I say, the perception of light in this place is sort of, to some degree, I think, governed by your perception rather than actual
the filters that you have.
And so I knew that I had to get up and I had to go through the room to the left and through a series of chambers into a particular room where a particular group of entities were waiting for me to debrief me on what had just happened to me in their incarnated life, possibly the cause of events much prior to that, but in particular what had happened just at the very end there. And I knew that Kurt was already in there or in a room similar having the same thing happen. There was the sensation of music and light coming from that direction, but I don't know whether there was actually music and light coming from that direction or whether that was the notion of me colouring the fact that I felt drawn to that place. So I knew that's what I had to do as soon as regaining consciousness, but it's not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was get up and go into the room on the right. And the room on the right I knew already. The association in my head that it was the equivalent of a powder room or a rest room, which of course is completely redundant in terms of being a spirit who's no longer incarnated. But I knew that it was a room probably about half the width of the one I was in, but about 3/4 of the length. And in terms of the room that I was presently being laid out that way, and one portal being that way, this room sort of ran off in this direction. And it had one very particular purpose. Again, it was all just clean surfaces, there was nothing else in it. But all along the left-hand wall of this room, I knew there was a reflective substance. I don't want to say mirror, but there was a space that was occupied by a field or a substance or a thing that gave off a reflection. It was not a mirror in the conventional sense of looking into a mirror, but it had the effect of a mirror, if you know what I mean. And what I wanted to do was go into that room and look into the mirror, as it were, and see if the face that I'd worn in that last life was as close as I thought it was to the face that I knew that I wore at the source. Because I was convinced that the face that I'd chosen to wear that last life was the closest I'd worn yet to the one I actually wear at the source. And that's what I did. I took the detour. So I got up and I walked into the room and I stopped and I turned to the left, and I knew if I took about another couple of steps I'd be in front of the reflective surface. I took 5 steps in, I turned about heel and made a point of looking at the join of the floor and the surface. Slowly looking up to the point where I would see my face, and then I woke up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Right then and there. And it was just like, I woke up and my first reaction was, fuck! I was like, damn it, I was this close, and then I fucking came back. Yeah, so...
What a thing to be able to do, though, to experience your own divinity. That's really, you're experiencing your own divinity, your true self.
At that point, yeah.
Yeah, at that point. So, maybe you're not supposed to.
Well, very much so. I don't think...
While you're carnated, at least, in this realm.
I don't think in general... I mean, I can't claim to even know how any of this works, but... If we are incarnated and then we do head back and learn lessons and then choose to be reincarnated again, if that's the way it works, I'm sure that, I don't know what the rules are surrounding being aware of the fact while you are incarnated, but I'm sure that even the notion of experiencing, even in a dream, the fact that that's the case and going back is probably not looked well upon in the rule book. You know, it's perhaps probably not encouraged. I suppose... In the nature of a reality like this, you can never prove it one way or another, so what does it really matter?
Exactly.
In the grand scheme of things, in terms of perhaps breaking any cosmological rules, but...
Do you think, though, also there might have been a fear, like on this level, on this conscious level, there would have been a fear in your dream state to actually view your true self, and that's what woke you up out of that dream?
Possibly. I think it...
As much of an excitement or... interest in you would have had, there would have been a bit of fear as well. To know your true self.
I think it's a safety mechanic.
I think
if I had seen what I had seen, it would probably have quite unnerved me on perhaps a psychological level. I
mean, the fact broken the space-time continuum right there.
Yeah, it's like typing Google into Google. It would have really messed some shit up, as it were.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that's probably why some of these parameters do exist, or why we wake up the way that we do. I think that's why normally probably most people, or even for me, for the majority of the dreams I've had in my life, when you're killed in a dream, you wake up. Just because the notion of even putting the idea into your head that might be what goes on could mess with a lot of people, or affect a lot of people. So that was one dream.
That's really interesting, man. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was one that very much stands out from a lot of the other ones. And that was the first time.
It all, sorry, just before we move on to the next one, was that all quite vivid though as well? More so than other dreams you'd had previously?
I'd say in terms of scale of lucidity and vividity, it's very much on the scale of a lot of the other dreams that I've had.
Right. Okay.
Very much so. But it was very much the first time. And it's happened, I think, on one other occasion where I've been killed, and that hasn't been the end of the dream.
Right. Okay.
The second time it happened, I can't even remember what the actual the context of my incarnation before being killed was. But the second time it happened, I actually still had sensory input when I left my soul. So I was killed in some capacity, left my soul, and I actually saw myself leave the planet and get into a space above the stratosphere of whatever planet it was that I was on. I still had visual input, and my consciousness got to a point above the planet at a certain altitude, or I suppose you lose altitude once you leave the atmosphere, so a certain distance above the body, and then my perspective turned and looked and rotated up through not the cloud bank, the view of the star field above me, fixated on a very particular point, and then, like in science fiction, going into the speed of light, I went into a star field and shot off towards that distant point at a very, very quick rate, and then I woke up.
Yeah, right.
So that was a very interesting take on it.
Yeah.
The second time round.
Sure.
And again, I don't actually recall what the context of the greater dream was on that second occasion.
Right.
But this dream was the first time that had ever happened to me, and those two occasions are the only two times that I've had the dreams where I've been killed and then left my consciousness and gone to some other place. The second dream I had, this was sometime after that first one. This was in 2011. I was living at Central Ave at the time. It was when I was still working at Chameleon Creative. Now this dream was my most the most clear-cut example of a lucid dream for me, in the sense that I had a lot of sensory input, and I very much felt like I was awake, but I also very much knew that I was dreaming too. And I had a lot more control over my actions even than normal at this point. I always have control over my actions, but I had a lot of tactile, conscious awareness of what I was doing, and a greater contextual understanding of what was happening around me, though at the same time I still came into a chain of events, as opposed to being in an abstract place where I could do things in particular.
Sure.
And this dream perhaps unnerved me more than a lot of the others that I've had. Again, it was very martial. So as I experienced it, I was consciously aware of the fact that I was in a state of sleep paralysis at some point as well, back where my body was. But I came to in a place that was in a desert, somewhere in a village. It was very sunny, and I came to hyperventilating. So I'll reenact it, and I'll explain it to you as I'm going.
Sure, go.
I came to crouched down, hyperventilating, and I looked down, and I was holding an M4, and I was in the combat garb of a US Marine, and I was cognizant of the fact that I was in a firefight somewhere in Iraq, and it was somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, probably around 2 o'clock, and I knew that because I could feel the warmth of the sun on me. I could feel the fact that I was hot from exertion. I could feel the weight of all the armor that I was wearing. I could feel the weight of the rifle in my hand. I could feel the warmth of the sun on me, and I was terrified, but I knew I was dreaming. But I knew that I was also involved in a very gnarly scenario, which had already been happening, but I'd suddenly jumped into the perspective of this thing happening.
And so what year was this? Did you have this?
2011 was when I had this dream.
Okay,
so I'm crouched down behind a low wall coming off of a building. I'm in it's not a street, it was like a back alley between buildings. The building in front of me was sunlit, so... and again, it was afternoon, so I was facing east, I suppose, thinking about it. I was in the shadow of a building behind me. I was down behind a low wall that came out from behind this building, and there were chips of concrete flying off this thing because I was being shot at. And I came to and I was like, holy shit, this is happening. This is actually happening. I'm here. I know it's not actually happening because I'm dreaming, but it's actually happening and I'm here and I'm crouched down and I'm legitimately fucking terrified anyway. Yeah. I knew that whoever this combatant was, I didn't know whether it was one or two of them. I knew they were down the street somewhere. And I was like, well, I'm here. Fuck it. Popped up, popped off 2 or 3 rounds. 1, 2, 3. Back down. Exchange fire. Again, 1, 2, 3. But I didn't really know where I was shooting. There was an alleyway about a building or two up on the right hand side. Pretty sure he was in there and he was popping out to let rounds off and back again. And at this point I was pretty sure it was just him. It was just one combatant. Came back down and thought, I knew that I was cut off from the rest of my unit. I knew that I was part of a 4 or 5 man fire team, and I knew that they were a couple of blocks east, I guess. I knew my sensation from the point of my perspective, being down behind this wall, the alley heading that way, this building, this house being in front of me, I knew they were a couple of blocks that way, which I guess is east, and I knew that they were heading towards a particular objective, and for whatever reason I'd been cut off from them. I knew that being cut off was not fucking good, and for the very sake of my survival alone, I needed to get back to where they were, let alone compromising objectives or anything else. So I popped back down behind cover and I thought to myself, shit, this could go on for hours. Like, we could just be trading shots and both of us are too terrified to actually stand out or stay above cover long enough to actually, put a meaningful shot in. So I thought, fuck this. I had hand grenades on my vest. So I thought, look, I don't even care if this takes the guy out. I'm going to pull the pin. I'm going to let one go across down the street. I'm going to wait for the thing to go off because that'll keep him behind cover. Then I'm going to run across the door. I'm going to kick the door and go through the house and try and get around this. I didn't even care about killing him. I didn't care about taking him out. I wanted to keep him distracted long enough to get the hell out of there and try and haul ass back to where the rest of my men were just to regroup with him. If I managed to take him out in the proceedings, fine. But I didn't really want to directly engage him. I was so freaked out that I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Yeah, right. So I waited. He let a bunch of rounds off, pulled the frag grenade, pulled the pin, held it about 2, popped up, lobbed it sideways, went back down, waited for about another second, bam! Got up, ran across, kicked the door, brought my rifle up, swept the room. Room was clear. It was like a single sort of room house. Like, it was, like beds were in a corner. There was a kitchen kind of the left. Just basic one room kind of house. Looked up, swept through it, clear, and there was another door almost exactly in that direction on the other side of the room, and I knew that would lead to another alleyway on the other side of the house. So I was moving across the room towards this door, thinking about where my fire team was and how I had to get to them. And then I was thinking, okay, I'm going to have to kick this door, and I know it's going to open left, which means it'll block rounds coming to the left side of the alley. So I'll need to sweep right first, and then check past the door left, because I knew that this alley that this guy was in would also end up on the next one that I was going into. Sure. So if he'd survived the grenade going off and he was still there, he would know that because I wasn't there anymore, I've probably gapped it across to the alley behind him, so he was going to be coming up to see me anyway. So
you had absolutely no one of strategy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like a Jason Bourne scenario. You just woke up and you knew what was going on.
I knew what the fuck I was doing.
Yeah, right.
I kicked the door, swept right, swept to the left, and then I woke up. And I woke up and I was hyperventilating, just holy fucking shit. Like, I sat upright in my bed and just went, holy fuck, and just kind of sat there repeating that out loud and just processing it and just running my hands over my face and just going, Jesus, for like about a good 20 minutes, like, that just happened. And some point either later on that day or a couple of days later, it occurred to me that perhaps that wasn't just a lucid dream. What if I had astral projected out of my body into the consciousness or the perception of an actual US Marine somewhere in Iraq, instead of actually just lucid dreaming that series of events?
Sure.
What if it wasn't just a lucid dream? What if I actually left my body and managed to merge consciousness with someone else for a brief period of time? That thought occurring to me sort of knocked me for 6, because the more I thought about it, the more that seemed like that was what happened.
Right.
But that was an absolute eye-opener, and by far and away, in terms of visceral input and feeling like I was very much awake and everything that was happening to me was very much happening to me, but also being aware that I was dreaming. Sure. That was by far the clearest cut example of a lucid dream I've ever had.
That's insane. I've never really heard of that as a perspective of inhabiting some other sort of consciousness. It was obviously in that space and time.
It was crazy. There's a lyrical reference that I had for it actually as well. There's a band called Opshot from New Zealand, alternative rock, and their first album they released in 2000. early 2000s, 2003 or 2004. They have a song at the end of the album. So the band is called Op Shop. The album is called Up Behind the Sun, and the last track on that album is called Awaken. And in the first verse of that, he makes reference to, I can't remember the exact lyrical reference off the top of my head right now, but he makes reference to being, to dreaming and trying on other faces and being in other places and then coming back to where he is. So that popped into my head straight away as soon as this epiphany kicked into my head.
Sure.
I thought, well, obviously there are other people who have experienced that before, and I'd read about the notion of such things as that happening, but never expected it to occur to me at all.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it was really, really, really fascinating and also very scary. And also, then after it happened, it was also kind of I thought, well, I wonder if that'll happen to me again. It was also quite an endearing experience, in spite of the fact that from the perspective of most people, it would have been quite a jarring experience for a lot of people, I think.
Almost like put into a state of shock.
Yeah.
Because of that happening, yeah.
There was a lot of sort of transference, I suppose. Well,
Sure.
there could have been a lot of transference emotionally, but from my side, my point of view, psychologically, it was very compartmentalized, and I understood what it was. So I didn't allow any of that to filter over.
Sure.
But then looking at it from another perspective, I do see often, or do joke about day-to-day life being a bit of a struggle and a bit of a battle anyway. And there are days where I feel like I'm shell-shocked regardless, you know. So as I say, there's a very strong martial streak running through not only my character as a person, but obviously my psychological point of view and my subconscious as well.
Sure.
I don't by any means endorse conflict or the notion of it, and I think that there's actually potentially nothing more terrifying than the notion of martial conflict as it exists in any capacity between any race.
Yeah, abhorrent is even a good word for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think if you ever experienced it from the perspective of a soldier, no matter how well trained or indoctrinated you've been, there is actually probably almost nothing more terrifying that you could experience, and I would not recommend it to anyone, and I don't particularly believe that it's the right way to do anything, but that's the nature of the universe and people to some degree as well, that conflict is very much, no matter how peaceful you want to be or how enlightened or transcendent you want to be, if you are incarnated, conflict is going to happen invariably, whether it's on an abstract level on a day-to-day basis, on an emotional level, on the level of interaction with other people, or whether it's in the most extreme case of a physical conflict, whatever the scale that is, you're going to come across it.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's just the whole part of the soul's experience, though, isn't it? Conflict and suffering. We've discussed that before on this podcast, but conflict and suffering has been a major learning tool for the soul and the soul's development.
Absolutely.
It's something that we don't really get from, I like to use the word the source as well, whatever the source is, you know, heaven, whatever it might be, other realm, God, it's all source, and you don't really get the opportunity, I wouldn't have thought, to experience things like that. But being incarnated into some sort of physical being, whichever realm or dimension it might be in, generally tends to, from stories that I've heard, obviously from yourself and other people and books I've read, tends to have a theme of conflict and suffering running through it.
Yeah.
So as much as we like to think, you know, it'd be great to live in a utopian society where everything's, you know, all great and, you know, everything's peaches, maybe that's not what, we're not supposed to have that anyway. We're supposed to have that conflict.
I've got some unnerving remarks to make on that level, from the nature of my, my philosophical, my existential perspective. The first thing I would say is that in terms of being an incarnated soul, coming into being incarnated physically, I've always loved that saying or that line, everything comes from somewhere else.
Yeah, sure.
And just as just a fundamental observation into the idea of being a spirit that's incarnated and learning lessons again and again and again and then going back somewhere, I've always liked that line, everything comes from somewhere else. Yeah. But then there's another line that's used, I can't remember where it originates from, but the gist of it is, as above, so below.
Okay,
and that filters through to a lot of different religions and a lot of different perspectives. The idea that in Christianity, for example, it's laws supposedly governed by the church are derived from how things operate in heaven. I don't know who their liaison is for that, but apparently that's how it goes, as above, so below.
Yeah.
And if we're sent down here, if the notion is that we're sent down here over a number of lives, say that's one theory, to learn a number of lessons, to develop and grow as a soul, my fundamental question to that is, toward what end?
Yeah.
Okay, so toward what end, as spirits, if we do come from a source, are we going through this notion of improvement, I suppose? What are we being built towards? And is that purpose in that particular plane, or is it a series of... the extrapolations are possibly infinite. But an unnerving thought that I've had is, what if this is legitimately boot camp? We are being trained through a series of lives, through a series of souls, to get our original, or our soul, or our original form back at the source, to a great enough level of understanding, of enlightenment, of comprehension, of awareness, to serve and facilitate a function at the source. So what if we get to a point where we've learned enough and we achieve enlightenment, or we stop being incarnated, we finish our training, we go back to the source. What if, when we get back there, we find out that that's because we need to go into government, or we need to go into production, or we need to go into the armed forces? And what if, even at the level of where we are incarnated from mortally and where we come back to, there's an institution that governs people going through the experience of going through lives and being incarnated and coming back? And what if, once we've graduated, as it were, we go back into society, and that's just another civilization there on another plane, and then we go off and live another existence, or come back to another existence there.
So it's like a fractal thing, you know,
Very
where
much
really this universe as we know is really just a fractal position of a higher realm, or whatever it may be. This place where you get incarnated to. Yeah, quite possibly.
What if we're injured or killed there? Or what if we commit some sort of act there? I've even thought about the notion of, if we can commit an act there that's considered to be, anti-Semitic, or just generally negative, and what if, as part of a program of not necessarily punishment but rehabilitation, we get put back into another series of reincarnations? What if it's not just one cycle through? What if perhaps if we don't, not necessarily that there's, well, I suppose if there was a society like that, there would be measure of performance of oneself, but also from an objective point of view as well. What if we go back through a couple of times in order to continue? Well, obviously we weren't as enlightened as we thought we were. We need to go back again. And then my question again there would be, if you're killed there, well then where do you go? And perhaps it is all fractal and it continues to go down the chain, and the mind can begin to boggle at that point. It could very much be like shining a point of light into a crystal and seeing all the refractions of it. The more you start to think about everything, the more insane everything really becomes, especially even at the day-to-day level. So I often get to a point where I have to stop thinking about all these sorts of things and go, okay, I gotta go to work today and do those those MRECs that need to go up for that ad that needs to be done by 5 p.m. for tomorrow. Or it's sunny out, that's good. Sure. And just be. Just come back, just being here. And
rather than worry about that too much.
Yeah, well, considering the point should be to be here anyway, I suppose.
Exactly. Well, that's really, we haven't been given the brain development or the ability to be able to comprehend that properly. So as fun as it is to actually be able to try and comprehend it, and things like psychedelics can help, but it can show you a glimpse into that nature, into that realm, that ability. But even then, I still wouldn't have thought we'd have the cognitive ability to be able to do it. So
absolutely.
I really like that idea. I've thought about it a little bit too. One I guess I'd subscribe to myself is the reason behind it all is if there's a oneness, and call it God or whatever it might be, I don't like using that term, but at this one point, that our experiences in these different worlds, different realms, are to help us bring us to that point, almost like a pyramid, to that oneness with God. And then I'd like to think that's it. Then that's how you spend your eternity, by helping souls underneath you, the whole spirit guide thing, and souls, clusters, and etc. that go with that. But it stands to reason that if this is the way, if that's a fractal position of that experience, there's no reason why it would just want to continue on and on, because the universe is fractals. And
there's nothing to say that the perception that I just described to you isn't just a step on the way to what you were talking about.
Quite possibly,
another step on that very same journey.
But in an infinite universe, so is that possible?
Well, it's infinitely possible. That's exactly the point. And scale in and of itself is almost kind of redundant in the same regard. As much as you extrapolate things out, time in and of itself, just as a notion, is simply a system of measurement.
Might as well forget about it.
We've put it into place to help us cope with being here, for example. So,
and getting things done.
And things like scale become just completely redundant at an extrapolated level, both in terms of physics and in terms of spiritually speaking as well. It's all just so crazy. And there was something very specific I wanted to say just then, and it suddenly escaped out of my head. And one of the I just like all these phrases and sayings and pieces of information and dialogue that are kicking around over whether it be authors or speakers or musicians over the course of the last couple of thousand years of human history. One of the other phrases that I've really, really liked is one of the notions of really simplified philosophy. But people ask the reason of why are we here? What's the meaning of life? I really love that someone once posited that an incarnated life is God or your creator or some spiritual agency that's above you posing a question to you at the source, and your life is that moment between you being asked the question and you coming back with your response. Yeah,
right. Okay. Yeah,
I really like that as well. It's always something that's really stuck with me in my head.
Yeah, sure.
It's a novel way of looking at things, but I always thought it was a really interesting way of looking at things as well. Yeah,
definitely. So you that's your time to comprehend that question, and comprehension is basically an incarnation or a carnation into whatever realm you're going into, or
absolutely. And they could corroborate back to all the things I was saying before. You literally could be in a room with your spirit guide or the next up in the progression, and before you go in. I also I read a book. Who the hell was it by? Our friend Sally gave it to me actually. Sally Van Buren.
Yep. Life Between Lives.
It was God, I can no longer recall the name of the book or the artist, but he was talking about how he puts people into hypnotherapy, and he gets there.
It's I've read the same book.
I know you know the book that I'm talking
about. I'm gonna have to quickly think of it. It's he's got a series of books. One's Life Between Lives.
Yeah.
I think that's it. Yeah, he's got other ones about incarnations and as well. But Life Between Lives, that's the first book she gave me to read when I first moved into Mount Lawley there.
Okay,
and it changed my whole. I was like, whoa, what's going on here?
One of the first books she gave me too, and
Andrew something his name is
potentially, but it added another dimension to the things that I was already beginning to think and believe. But a lot of what came through from that was the notion of exactly this happening. You're part of a certain group of souls, and from his perspective, we're all in some sort of training environment back at the source.
And like your friend, you would have been in that room with that. Would have been part of your soul cluster.
Part of my soul cluster. Yeah, and of course, as you spend further and further and go longer through the process of incarnation, and get closer to the top.
Sure.
Of course, you're going to have a sort of a wider index of people that you know or that you've spent a lot of lives with, and you become to recognize them very much more swiftly. But one of the things they talked about in and amongst all of that book was the notion that we write the script of our lives before we come down as well, and very much plan out what our lessons will be before we get there. So you
can glimpse into these visions of that person walking down the street doing this particular thing, and you go, okay, that sounds like a life, or looks like a life I need to have in order to learn the lessons I need to learn in this particular juncture.
And choosing it down to the nation you're born of, the parents, and cultivating that all and tailoring it down to the things you need to learn on a very fine scale.
Sure.
But of course allowing for variables to occur and alternate paths and alternate endings, and there being an ideal way to go through it to learn what you need to, and then a couple of sort of other variations just in case certain things don't come past along the way. But just the idea if that was the case, that you would come back to a peer group or an instructor afterwards and go, well, that went well.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, holy shit! Did you see that just now? Okay.
Yeah.
Just that idea. But even that simplified philosophy would fit into that too.
Yeah,
just
definitely.
Going back, and you being asked a question before you're incarnated and going, okay, I'll keep that in mind. Yeah. And then when you come back, going, honestly, can I think about that for a second? Or coming back and going, yes or no or green or 42 or whatever the answer, is. It's
something that's definitely plausible, and there's a guy called Aubrey Marcus who's experienced ayahuasca a few times, and he's done iboga as well, and I think it was during his iboga trip where he learned that there is just one source, but heaven and hell is that feeling that you get once you've left this body, and it's looking back on the life that you've led. So either you've lived a good, wholesome life where you've helped other people and tried to... It's a perspective thing, and then you can go back to source and you're like, I did a good job. I feel good about myself, just as you do day to day if you've done a good deed or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Or the alternative is you've been a shitty, fucked up person and you keep that with you, and That's part of your experience when you first go back to source.
Yeah.
But as this book that we were discussing, it's part of the learning experience.
Yeah.
So then if you've done things as maybe even a shortcut or done it the wrong way, you might need to stay there longer in that sort of source realm, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And if you've sort of done it well or whatever it might be, you still learn back and reflect on it.
Yeah.
But you might not need as long in that, and you can come back again to this carnation that you want to go to or choose.
Absolutely.
And to me that sounds like a more plausible idea of what heaven and hell would be. Is really how you've lived the life that you've lived as a carnation in any particular point in time and space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like the notion as well that there are lives within lives too, and that you go through different phases of your life, and they can just, from an abstract point of view, very much be looked at as you can live and die a couple of times within the face of this life, in terms of holding on perhaps to a certain set of beliefs that shape your perspective up to a certain point, and then something happening to you and completely changing the way you look at things.
Yeah.
From a certain philosophical point of view, you could argue that at that point who you were has died and you've become someone new.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of continuity even there. But I think people experience such notions as heaven and hell on a localized day-to-day basis as well. Like, people joke about you being in a certain scenario, whatever it is, or even just the notion of people just talk about the idea of being in an office, going to 9 to 5, doing the same thing day out is not only the definition of insanity, but also perspectively the notion of hell. Like, this is hell. Like, we're actually, we may as well be in hell now. It's very subjective, and I think it can occur on a localized level as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Somehow it's just, you made me think there too about lives within lives. But another point in that book, I think it was A Journey of Souls, might have been the
That's
book.
it. That's it.
Journey of Souls.
Yeah.
Andrew, was it Andrew Strassman, or am I thinking of someone else?
I think you're thinking of someone else.
Yeah.
I can't think of it.
Journey of Souls, anyway, check it out. But they also spoke about a soul being able to incarnate two bodies. So perhaps maybe that dream that you had, or that experience you had,
well, that did occur to me.
Part of your soul.
It was actually after was it after or before I read this book? That'd be really interesting to know whether it was after or before I'd read the book that the dream occurred.
Yeah,
I know it was the same year.
Was it? Okay.
But I don't know whether it was after or before I'd read the book.
Yeah.
But that notion of fragmentation, even a soul being able to incarnate in sometimes like 2, 3, 4 different people at once, was something that really struck me. And I thought, you talk about meeting your soulmate, and just the notion of the fact that you may have actually just met another fragment of yourself.
Yeah, your own soul,
just the possibilities that came from that idea, again, they struck me too. And I thought, holy hell, that's something I hadn't even stopped to think about.
Yeah.
There are so many different permutations of how that process could take place, that there's, and that's something I hadn't even thought to think about. I always thought of the idea of a soul incarnating singularly. And I suppose, and it makes me wonder whether that happens at a level of experience where you've done the single incarnation thing enough that you can kind of handle a couple of different
as you've
points
experienced.
Of view. And also to the degree of how much strain. It makes me think of soul there being overachievers and souls, and people that are sort of going at a steady pace, and people that are trying to get through it faster as well, and lots of things like that. It was a fascinating read. It was one of those books that I was really glad that someone gave it to me, because it really did change a lot of my things perspective wise. Even though my personal philosophical standpoint, I kind of felt like there was something, it didn't quite align with me, but it did very quite closely align as well. But I incorporated my own belief structure and my perspectives into it, and I still think it was one of the more interesting and I would say accurate from my perspective, or believable, or relatable ways of looking at things, I suppose, that I've come across up to this point. It was a fascinating read, very much so. Because
it had a scientific basis to it, if you can call hypnotism scientific, but it was quantitative. They had case studies where people were discussing their experiences, and it was researched and put down. Again, grain of salt and all that as well.
Obviously,
but I think you're the same as me, where it sounds like we both read it and we're like, that's right. That's what happens. And very much that feeling of knowing that's okay. This is very plausible and quite possibly what happens. Just one thing I was thinking too. Have you heard of DMT, dimethyltryptamine? And it's naturally occurring chemical in the body.
Okay.
It comes from the pineal gland, but they call it the spirit molecule.
Okay.
If you've heard that, DMT, the spirit molecule.
Whether I've heard of it or not, and recall that, whether it's just passed through my consciousness, I'm not sure. But I've possibly heard of it, but it hasn't stayed in my head.
Cool. Well, I've got a good doc on that I'll give you as well, along with the Bill Hicks one. I'm going to have to
Absolutely.
give it to you as well.
Really,
but
really like to see it.
very fascinating. So DMT is found. People can smoke DMT and alter different realms, have spiritual experiences, or just whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But it's found in ayahuasca as well. It's the main component in ayahuasca. And but anyway, what can happen when someone's going through extreme trauma or suffering, then and I don't know if I don't think I've read this. It's more just experiences I've had, and also talking to friends of mine. Yeah. You know, it might be migraine or something where you're really struggling. You know, you're in pain somehow. DMT is released within the pineal gland, and it's found in the lungs, and it's found in plants. You know, that's acacia plant especially, and that's where it comes from. But when the DMT is secreted, that allows for a gateway to open, etc., or some sort of vibration increases where you become more spiritually prone or available.
I see, yeah.
So perhaps this occurrence in Iraq was this human body that was there was going through such trauma,
God, if ever there was a case for that to come to pass, I think a firefight would definitely be what would allow for it to happen.
And so that this DMT was being released from this person, and then you were able to access that person because either it was the same similar soul or part of your soul, or you're completely different souls, but you were able to tune into his mode of being, or that soul's mode of being at that particular point in time.
I would, and I like that notion. I like that I was probably under like some sort of stress, or whether it was day to day or week to week or trauma. Obviously on a much more pedestrian scale or relative scale, I guess. On my end in Perth.
But maybe you weren't though in Perth. Maybe you were in the right position. Maybe you're really passive, and that's what it took.
Maybe that's what. Maybe it was the opposite. Maybe I was calmer. Maybe I was in just the right mindset at the opposite end of the spectrum to be able to facilitate the connection, perhaps.
Yeah.
But what I would really love to know is if I'm right about that notion of projecting to him and that being the mechanism that connected us. What was the thought that went through his head just before I arrived?
Yeah.
And did that thought in and of itself too perhaps some sort of effect on facilitating the connection between him and I?
Maybe it was hopelessness, or
I'm
fucked.
Or maybe he thought about a certain person that he loved, or maybe he thought about something completely abstract, and maybe that is part of what facilitated the connection as well. Really interesting. It makes me wonder about what particular, if it was later in 2011, it makes me wonder whether it was a particular period in time because of a particular series of events that happened. So you talking about this has been very interesting in terms of maybe it was the events that were happening at the time that allowed me to be in that position. Very interesting, very fascinating.
It's a very good read, DMT Spirit Molecule. I've got the book, it's at my old house actually, unfortunately, but if you get a hold of it, I'll give you the doco as well.
Yeah,
but it's just Alex Gray's in there, and a couple other notable luminaries on the subject, and just very interesting take on what happens when you have DMT, the spirit molecule, available to you.
I'd love to see it. Very much so.
Quite interesting. How are we going for time here?
I was wondering that.
52 minutes. I think we might wrap up there.
I think we've gotten to a good juncture. Definitely.
Really interesting. It's a shame you live over Sydney now, but I'm sure we'll be back again.
I will be. I've very much said this is one of my favourite lyrical references of all time, and I'm sure it comes from other places as well. It's actually Jared Leto's band 30 Seconds to Mars, their first album before that.
Are they any good?
I would recommend, if you're going to listen to any of their stuff, listen to the first album, because it was much before they came into, I suppose, a mainstream spotlight. But there's a line from one of the songs on his first album where he says, "It's not a matter of luck, it's just a matter of time." And that's a line that comes back to me a lot of the time. But I've gotten to a perspective where I'd always felt homeless, in a spiritual sense, I suppose, or a philosophical sense as well, before I moved to Perth. I found home in Perth. And then I got here, and it established to me that on a personal level I was still empty. I'm very much in this life. I'm very much about looking for my soulmate. I'm very much looking for that, and so I found home. I found stability here. My family's here. I rebuilt myself from traumatic events that had happened in terms of love some years prior, and possibly even in events that had happened further back in my childhood behind that as well. I took 6 months off when I first got here to Perth at the start of 2009, and staying with my auntie, she very much helped to rehabilitate me. And I knew that I was a bit of a mess by the time I'd left New Zealand, but Christ, I actually didn't really realise how much of a mess I was until that 6 months came to pass, and I looked at it and went, hell, I've made a lot of progress in that 6 months. You know what I mean?
Sure. You can be a bit more objective about it when you're looking back on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then 3 years living in Perth came to pass, and I very much got to a point where I feel like, okay, I'm very much back on the level. This is home. But I'd always wanted to live over east for a number of reasons. And for some reason, I got into my head that wherever the girl is, she ain't here. And took off, and on an ocean like that as well. But one of the things I've learned, and I suppose I was cognizant of this before I did it anyway, but one of the things I became cognizant of while I've been living over there is, no matter how much I run or move from a demon or a problem, no matter how I shift my perspective on any given issue, really that's all I'm doing. I'm shifting perspective. The problem or the lesson or the event is always going to be there in front of me. The backdrop is sort of irrelevant in a way.
Exactly.
I very much love living in Sydney. Sydney's been absolutely amazing. My job there is brilliant. It's the kind of job that a lot of designers my age and even just young people my age would pretty much fall over themselves to get into. My employer there is Christ. We spoke about this briefly on Saturday night. I won't go into it too much, but she's very much become a mentor figure for me, and I very much didn't pick her to be a mentor at all at the beginning of it.
Well, role models don't necessarily have to be the perfect human beings.
This is the first time that's really become true to me, and I made the observation that she's the most unlikely person I think I could ever have picked to be a role model for me in terms of my perception when I first met her. And that is perhaps one of the highest compliments I've ever paid out to any role model I've known, no matter how much I've loved role models beforehand. But what I've learned over the last, so I've been in Sydney since 1st of April last year. What I've learned over the last wee while is that Perth is very much home, and I will very much be returning inevitably, whether it's 6 months, a year, 2 years, 10 years. I joke that my plan is to get the girl and bring her back. But geez, finding a girl bad enough for the job is one thing. You know, like whether she's from Perth or whether she loves Perth enough, that's a whole different set of variables. And having that in my head and projecting that onto a relationship to start with is probably a bit... it's putting a lot of expectations. A bit fucking chaotic, a bit hectic to be fair. So I will invariably be back. And possibly sooner rather than later. And it's really interesting. I did a card reading at my auntie's place last night. And the message that came out was that I'm very much on the precipice of another very big change in my life, and it will come about from or as a result of a short trip. And I actually couldn't help but wonder if it was on the trip that I'm on now as opposed to another one that will come up very shortly.
Possibly.
So I'm very much open to the idea of coming back, and it will happen sooner rather than later.
But don't plan it or anything. Just I
never do.
However it goes.
I'm very much subscribed to following instinct.
And we're going to be catching up in a few weeks' time anyway. I'm going to be over in Sydney as my stop over to South America, so I couldn't think of any better way to approach the South America trip than catch up with you that night. Be fantastic. So we can continue this conversation. Maybe sans a microphone and camera, unfortunately, but I'm sure we'll do one of these again one other day. Now. You do a lot of work outside of your profession as far as creativity goes. Do you have a website that people can...
I do a lot of... So I'm a graphic designer. I do a lot of digital abstract... Well, I used to do a lot of digital abstract artworks. A lot of abstract architectural photography, and then layers of light and iconography filtered through that to convey an emotional state or perception. But in more recent years, and especially in the last 3 or 4 years, I've done a lot of writing. I write a lot of poetical shorts and abstracts and observational stuff, and I publish all of that to my Redbubble profile. So I think it's literally redbubble.com/people/Laz Totka, LAZTOTKA.
Cool.
I can send you a link for that, so you can put that up on the podcast, or read it out perhaps at some point. If you want to see any of my writing or any of my stuff, you can very much find it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to put that out.
That's right, man. It's very really interesting stuff that you do, and I think I first had a look at it a couple of years ago when we first met. But really sort of intriguing stuff, and it's something that I think a lot of people get a lot out of to have a look at. So it'd be certainly interesting, and definitely I'll put it up there. It'd be fantastic to do.
Thank you very much.
That's all right, mate. No problem at all. All right. I think we might Quality. Anything else you might want to discuss, or
No,
leave it at that for now? And we'll continue it again sometime, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Cool. We'll do that. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening again. And as like with any other podcast, if you've got any questions or want to get in contact with myself or Laz as well, if you've got any questions, especially about the subjects we spoke about today, just let us know. But otherwise, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well done, mate.
Cheers.
That's excellent.
Thank you.
Really, really good.
It was a really enjoyable experience. It was very, very cool.
Yeah, nice.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it's always get a good feeling when you finish these things. You starts off a little bit nervous, like, okay, I've talked to like this whoever out there, but then you get into it, it's really good, and then you finish it, it's like, that was a really good fucking conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's brilliant. I'm going to go into Mount Lawley after this and just spend the rest of the afternoon hanging out, so I've got lots to think about. It's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll get you that, I'll do it for you now, I guess. I'll get you that doco, that DMT spirit molecule, and
cool. Love to.
Bill
I've got
Hicks.
a flash drive on me.
Awesome, man. That's perfect then.
Yeah.